There's a specific kind of silence that doesn't come from shock, it comes from recognition. The kind where people don't look at her, they look at each other. Because everyone in that room heard the sentence, but only a few understood what it meant. She didn't raise her voice, didn't defend herself, didn't hesitate. She just repeated it, word for word, as if placing it somewhere permanent. Then she walked out. And in that moment, it felt like she had just lost everything. But 6 hours later, the room would realize something far more dangerous. She hadn't reacted. She had triggered something. The meeting had already run 10 minutes over, but no one moved. Not because it was productive, but because something in the air had shifted. The kind of shift you don't announce. You feel it. It was subtle at first. A pause that lingered half a second too long. A glance that didn't return. The faint sound of a pen stopping mid-note. And then, her sentence. It didn't sound dramatic. No raised tone, no emphasis. Just precise, clean, placed exactly where it needed to be. Across the table, someone leaned back slightly, not in comfort, but distance, because even before the CEO spoke, there was already tension forming, quiet, structural. The CEO didn't miss it. He leaned forward, hands flat on the table, voice controlled, but sharpened. For that one sentence, "You're fired." There it was, clear, public, irreversible, or at least, that's how it sounded. A few people instinctively looked down, others froze mid-breath, because it wasn't just the decision, it was how fast it came. No pause, no question, no internal discussion, just execution. And that's when something unexpected happened. She didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't even blink. She simply repeated the sentence, exactly, word for word, not louder, not softer, just identical, as if confirming it, or documenting it. And that's when the discomfort deepened. Because repetition changes things. It removes emotion. Turns words into record. Across the room, someone shifted in their seat. Another reached for their phone, then stopped halfway. No one said anything. But now they weren't just hearing what had been said. They were processing what had just been created. Because something about that repetition didn't feel like resistance. It felt like placement. Like a key turning quietly in a lock no one else had noticed. She closed her notebook. Not abruptly, not symbolically, just with the calm precision of someone finishing a task. Then she stood up. No rush, no hesitation. And walked out. The door didn't slam. It clicked. Soft. Controlled. Final. And for a moment, nothing followed. No one spoke. No one moved. Because the room wasn't reacting to her leaving. It was reacting to what stayed behind. That sentence. Now echoed. Now fixed. Now different. At the far end of the table, someone finally exhaled. But it didn't release the tension. It confirmed it. Because in systems like this, the most dangerous moments aren't loud. They're quiet, measured, and already in motion. And whether anyone realized it or not, this moment wasn't over. It had just been recorded. And that changes everything. But what no one in that room understood yet was exactly what they had just activated. By the time the meeting ended, the narrative had already begun to stabilize. Not officially, but internally. People didn't discuss it directly. They reframed it. Emotional reaction. Wrong timing. Not aligned with leadership. Labels appeared fast, clean, convenient, because labeling restores order. It gives the room something to hold on to when something doesn't feel right. And what had just happened? Didn't feel right. Still, systems like this don't pause. They normalize. Within minutes, calendars resumed. Conversations restarted. Messages were sent as if nothing had shifted. But beneath that surface, something had. At 11:12 a.m., a message reached legal, short, structured, without commentary. Subject line, restatement confirmation. No urgency flag, no escalation marker, just precision. It didn't look like a complaint. It didn't read like an objection. It felt like a record. And that distinction, subtle, almost invisible, mattered, because records don't argue, they establish. By 1119, it was forwarded. No added text, no interpretation, just passed along. That's how signals move in systems like this, quietly, without friction. At 1126, someone in compliance opened it, paused, read it again, then leaned back slightly. Not in surprise, in recognition, because now the sentence wasn't part of a meeting, it was part of a structure. And structures behave differently. They don't rely on memory, they rely on trace. By 1134, another document was pulled, internal, archived, rarely accessed, not because it wasn't important, but because it was specific, very specific. Section 11, whistleblower. A clause most people knew existed, few had actually seen applied, even fewer had seen activated. The language was exact, no ambiguity, no room for interpretation, not emotional, mechanical, and suddenly, the earlier moment in the meeting, the repetition, the tone, the timing, started to realign. Because it wasn't repetition, it was confirmation, and confirmation, under Section 11, behaves like a switch. Once triggered, it doesn't ask for permission. It initiates sequence. Across departments, small things began to shift. Access logs flagged, internal communications mirrored, certain files preserved. Not because someone ordered it, because the system did, automatically. That's the part no one prepares for, because when protection activates, control redistributes, not visibly, but structurally. At 12:02, the CEO received a brief internal ping. No subject line, just a reference number. He opened it, read it once, then again, slower, because the words were familiar. But now they carried weight. Not the kind you argue with, the kind that accumulates. Silently. Across the floor, conversations began to shorten, not abruptly, carefully, as if people were choosing words they hadn't needed to choose before, because now there was a possibility no one had accounted for, that the moment they thought was finished was actually the beginning of a process they couldn't stop, and somewhere between those quiet adjustments, that sentence, the one that ended everything in the room, had already started doing something else, something far more precise, something irreversible, because in systems like this, protection doesn't announce itself, it embeds, and once it does, every action after becomes part of its record. But what no one had calculated yet was how far that record would reach. If you've ever seen a moment like this, where a single sentence quietly shifts control without anyone raising their voice, pause here, because what feels like just a meeting is rarely just a meeting. Sometimes it's documentation in motion, sometimes it's a trigger, and sometimes it's the exact point where outcomes stop being decided by people and start being defined by structure. By early afternoon, the building looked exactly the same. Same conversations in the corridors, same quiet hum of systems, same controlled rhythm of a company that prided itself on stability. But stability, in environments like this, is often just well-managed inertia, because underneath, things had started to move, not dramatically, precisely. At 12:47, IT received an automated directive. No sender, no discussion, just a protocol trigger tied to a clause most people preferred never to interact with. Data preservation, full scope, not selective. That detail mattered, because selective preservation is strategy, full preservation is preparation. Within seconds, logs that would normally rotate began to lock, email threads duplicated into secured layers, access histories mirrored. Even deleted fragments, partial, temporary, forgotten, were quietly restored into traceable states. No announcement, no alert banners, just a shift in how the system behaved. Because when Section 11 activates, the system doesn't protect people, it protects sequences. Across legal, a second review began. Not of the meeting, of the context, the months before it, communications, patterns, decisions, not to interpret, to map. That distinction is critical. Interpretation invites opinion. Mapping reveals structure, and structure doesn't negotiate. At 1312, someone in senior management requested a routine file. Access denied, not permanently, conditionally, pending review. That's when the first real hesitation appeared, not visible, but felt. Because access in systems like this is assumed until it isn't. And when that assumption breaks, people don't panic. They adjust, carefully. Conversations became shorter, approvals slower, words more deliberate. Because somewhere in the background an understanding was forming. This wasn't escalation, it was containment. At 1326, legal cross-referenced the original statement. The sentence, simple, direct, unadorned, but now anchored, time-stamped, contextualized, protected, and protection changes the hierarchy of truth, because once something is protected, it doesn't compete with other narratives, it overrides them. Across the building, small corrections started appearing, emails reworded, decisions postponed, meetings rescheduled, not canceled, deferred. That's how systems buy time when they lose control. They don't stop, they slow. At 1341, the CEO requested a briefing. Short, private, focused. He didn't ask what happened, he asked what had been triggered, and that question was the first accurate one of the day. Because by now, it wasn't about the meeting, it wasn't about the sentence, it wasn't even about her. It was about the mechanism now running beneath all of it. A mechanism designed not to react, but to record, preserve, and if necessary, expose. And mechanisms like that don't rush. They accumulate, piece by piece, line by line, until the picture they form is no longer optional to acknowledge. Across legal, the room stayed quiet, not tense, focused, because they had seen this before, rarely, but enough to recognize the pattern, and patterns, once identified, tend to complete themselves. Somewhere deep in the system, another layer finalized, not visible on any dashboard, not flagged in any report, but active and expanding. Because protection, once activated, doesn't stay contained to the moment that triggered it. It reaches backward and forward, simultaneously. And that means one thing. What just happened in that meeting was no longer the event, it was evidence, and everything after it would be measured against it. But the part no one was ready to face yet was what happens when evidence stops being passive and starts aligning. By mid-afternoon, the company had stopped pretending this was contained, not openly, but structurally, because containment requires boundaries, and those were no longer holding. At 1408, the first external flag appeared, not dramatic, not escalated, just a quiet notation tied to internal compliance routing, the kind that doesn't ask for attention, it redirects it. Across legal, one phrase began to repeat, not out loud, but in how people moved. Chain integrity. Because once Section 11 is active, it's not about a single moment, it's about continuity, what led to it, what followed it, and whether every step holds. At 1417, they found the first inconsistency. Small, almost irrelevant in isolation, a timestamp misaligned with an approval, minutes off. But in systems like this, minutes are not time, they're sequence, and sequence is everything. No alarms were raised, no one pointed it out, they simply marked it, quietly, because marking doesn't accuse, it accumulates. Across departments, the effects became harder to ignore. Approvals that normally took seconds now paused, not denied, re-evaluated. Threads that would have moved forward looped back, because now everything passed through a different filter. Would this hold under review? And that question changes behavior, not dramatically, subtly. At 1429, a second inconsistency surfaced. Different team, different context, same pattern, a decision recorded, before the discussion that justified it, not by hours, by minutes, but again, sequence. And once patterns begin to echo, they stop being coincidence. Across the executive floor, movement slowed, doors closed more often, Conversations shifted from open to contained, because people weren't reacting to a problem anymore, they were adjusting to exposure. At 1442, the internal map began to form, not visual, conceptual, a network of actions, decisions, and timings, now being aligned, compared, cross-referenced, and when alignment starts, it rarely stops where you expect. Because alignment doesn't look for issues, it reveals them, one connection at a time. Across legal, no one spoke about outcomes. That wasn't the focus. The focus was completeness, because once a record is complete, outcomes don't need to be argued. They follow. At 1455, the CEO received a second briefing. More detailed, less interpretive, no conclusions, just structure. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, just listened, because by now even he understood. This wasn't something you steer, it's something you withstand. Across the building, a quiet recalibration took place, not instructed, instinctive. Emails drafted, then rewritten, statements softened, certainty reduced, because now every word carried potential weight, and weight, in this context, accumulates quickly. At 1507, one final layer locked into place, not visible, but decisive, because it connected the original moment to everything that followed, cleanly, without gaps. And that's when the atmosphere changed again, not tense, resolved, because once alignment reaches that point, there's nothing left to adjust, only to face. And somewhere in that stillness, a realization settled in. This was never about one sentence, it was about what that sentence exposed, and exposure, once structured, doesn't disappear. It persists, but the part no one had fully processed yet was what happens when persistence turns into consequence. By late afternoon, the building had gone quieter, not empty, controlled, as if the system itself had lowered its voice, because by now there was nothing left to initiate. Everything that needed to move already had. At 1532, legal closed the active mapping phase, not because it was finished, because it was sufficient. That distinction matters, because in environments like this, sufficient is the threshold where action becomes inevitable, not optional, not debatable, inevitable. Across the record, the sequence now held, clean, continuous, without interruption. The original sentence, time-stamped, confirmed, protected, sat at the beginning. Everything else followed, aligned, supported, irrefutable. At 1541, the internal classification updated, not visible to most, but decisive. From review to actionable. No announcement, no escalation email, just a change in state. Because systems like this don't dramatize transitions, they execute them. Across the executive floor, the tone shifted again. Less uncertainty, more awareness, because once something becomes actionable, it no longer depends on interpretation. It proceeds. At 1548, the CEO requested one final clarification. Not about the clause, not about the sequence, about timing. How contained is this? A precise question. And the answer came just as precise. It isn't. Not aggressive, not confrontational, just accurate, because containment requires control, and control had already shifted, not visibly, but structurally. At 1556, external counsel was notified, no details, just access, because once a process reaches this phase, it doesn't stay internal, it extends, carefully, formally, permanently. Across the building, the realization settled in fully now. Nothing more needed to be said. Every word that mattered had already been spoken, and recorded, and protected. The sentence that ended her presence in that room had defined everything that followed, not because of emotion, not because of reaction, because of placement, because it was said, confirmed, captured, exactly as required, and now the system was doing what it was designed to do, not loudly, not visibly, but completely. At 1607, the final internal note was logged. No conclusion, no summary, just a status. Protection active, sequence intact. That's all it needed. Because in structures like this, outcomes don't arrive as surprises, they emerge as consequences. Logical, sequential, unavoidable. Across the glass walls and quiet corridors, one truth remained. The moment they thought was an ending was never an ending. It was a trigger, and once triggered, it doesn't ask who's ready. It proceeds, exactly as designed. Silence didn't follow because nothing happened. Silence followed because everything did.